Medical experts estimate that 1 in every 140 children will experience some form of selective mutism during their developmental years. Most recover within 18 months through conventional therapy, but statistics mean nothing when you're staring at 3 empty beds at 3 a.m., wondering if your children will ever call your name again. Vincenzo Romano had built an empire on the principle that every problem had a solution if you were willing to pay the right price. Money could buy silence, money could buy loyalty, money could buy the kind of fear that kept enemies awake at night, calculating the cost of crossing the Romano family. But money, he'd discovered, couldn't buy back his children's voices. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. Elena had been driving the triplets home from their violin lesson when the delivery truck ran the red light. The impact crushed the passenger side of their Mercedes, killing Elena instantly and trapping 6-year-old Marco, Sophia and Lucia in twisted metal for 47 minutes before the fire department could cut them free. They'd emerged with minor physical injuries, broken ribs, a fractured wrist, some stitches. The doctors called it miraculous. The silence that followed was anything but. 18 months later, Vincenzo Romano sat in the back booth of Nonna Rosa's Italian restaurant, watching his children arrange breadsticks in perfect geometric patterns while the rain hammered against the windows of Little Italy. Marco lined up exactly 7 breadsticks, each one precisely 2 inches apart. Sophia tapped her fingers against the red checkered tablecloth in groups of 4 beats. Lucia stared at her reflection in the water glass, her dark eyes holding the kind of ancient sadness that no child should carry. They hadn't spoken a single word since the accident. Vincenzo had tried everything. The best child psychologists in Manhattan, specialists flown in from Switzerland who charged $10,000 for a consultation, art therapists, music therapists, equine therapists who promised that horses could unlock what human intervention couldn't reach. He'd bought a ranch in Connecticut specifically for the horse therapy. The animals were beautiful, gentle creatures who nickered softly when the children approached. Marco, Sophia and Lucia had petted their necks with careful reverence, but they never spoke to them. Dr. Harriet Singh at Mount Sinai had used terms like traumatic selective mutism and psychological protective mechanism. She'd explained that the children's minds had shut down their verbal communication to shield them from processing their mother's death. Recovery was possible, she assured him, but it required patience, consistency, and the right therapeutic approach. They'd tried cognitive behavioral therapy, play therapy, family counselling sessions where Vincenzo sat in miniature chairs designed for children while Dr. Singh asked him about his relationship with his late wife. The bills totalled more than most people made in a lifetime. The results were a stack of files marked "No significant progress." Nonna Rosa's had become their Tuesday ritual 8 months ago. Elena had brought the children here every week after their music lessons, ordering them spaghetti carbonara and watching them giggle as they attempted to twirl the noodles properly. Giuseppe Romano, the owner, was no relation to Vincenzo's family, but he'd known Elena since childhood. He never charged them for the meals. He simply brought the food and retreated to his kitchen, understanding that some wounds needed familiar spaces to heal. The restaurant smelled like garlic and basil and the kind of tomato sauce that simmered for 6 hours. Red wine stained the wooden tables. Photographs of Sicily covered the walls alongside certificates from the health department and yellowed newspaper clippings about Giuseppe's grandmother's original recipes. It was the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family might sit around a table arguing in rapid Italian while children darted between the chairs, sticky with gelato. Vincenzo's security detail maintained a discreet perimeter. Tony Marconi sat at the bar nursing an espresso, his eyes scanning every customer who entered. 2 additional men flanked the front and rear exits. The routine was seamless, invisible to civilian diners, but comprehensive enough to neutralize any threat. The Romano family never moved without protection, especially not with the children. "Papa, The voice was so soft that Vincenzo initially thought he'd imagined it. But Sophia was looking directly at him, her small hand pressed against the table. Her lips moved again. Papa. Vincenzo's heart stopped, then started again, hammering so hard he thought the sound might shatter the wine glasses. Sophia hadn't spoken in 18 months, not a word, not even in her sleep. But it wasn't Sophia. It was Marco, seated beside her, who'd whispered the word while pointing at a man entering through the restaurant's front door. Vincenzo followed his son's gaze and saw Angelo Torino shaking rain from his coat, scanning the dining room until his eyes found their booth. The disappointment hit like a physical blow. His children remained silent. It had been his own desperate imagination, his mind so hungry for their voices that it created sounds where none existed. Marco was simply pointing. Sophia was simply staring. Lucia was simply arranging sugar packets in a pattern that meant nothing to anyone except her. Angelo approached their table with the measured confidence of a man who'd been Vincenzo's lieutenant for 15 years. He was dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, his dark hair slicked back with pomade that probably cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills. Everything about Angelo projected wealth, power, and the kind of controlled violence that kept the Romano Empire running smoothly. "Boss!" Angelo's voice carried the deference of a soldier, but the familiarity of family. "Sorry to interrupt dinner, but we've got a situation with the Brooklyn Territory that needs your attention." Vincenzo glanced at his children. Marco had abandoned his breadstick arrangement to watch Angelo with the intense focus he typically reserved for his geometric patterns. Sophia's fingers had stilled against the tablecloth. Lucia was studying Angelo's reflection in her water glass, her head tilted at an angle that suggested she was trying to solve some internal puzzle. "Not here," Vincenzo said quietly, "not in front of them." Angelo's eyes flicked to the children, then back to Vincenzo. His expression softened slightly, the hardened criminal replaced momentarily by the man who'd watched these children take their first steps, who'd bought them birthday presents and Christmas gifts, who'd carried a screaming Sophia to the hospital when she'd fallen off her bicycle at age 4. "Of course, I'll wait in the car." As Angelo turned to leave, something remarkable happened. Lucia reached across the table and touched Vincenzo's hand, not demanding attention, not seeking comfort, but offering it. Her small fingers pressed against his knuckles with deliberate gentleness. She couldn't speak, but she understood. Somehow, his youngest daughter recognized his pain and was trying to heal it with the only tool she possessed: touch. Vincenzo looked down at their joined hands and felt something crack open in his chest. Not hope, exactly. Hope had been crushed too many times over the past 18 months, but possibility, the recognition that his children were still reaching toward him, still trying to communicate, still fighting their way back to the living world through whatever pathway they could find. Outside, the rain continued to fall on the streets of Little Italy, washing the day's dust into storm drains that would carry it toward the Hudson River. Inside Nonna Rosa's, 3 silent children sat with their father, surrounded by the ghosts of Tuesday dinners when their mother's laughter had filled the air and their own voices had joined the symphony of family life. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as Vincenzo realized that tomorrow he would bring them here again, and the silence would continue, and he would sit in this same booth watching them arrange objects in patterns he couldn't decode, hoping for words that might never come. But tonight Lucia's hand remained pressed against his own, warm and steady and alive. And perhaps that would have to be enough. The first sign of sabotage came 3 days after the engagement dinner, when Isabella arrived at the art studio to find her carefully organised therapy materials scattered across the floor like evidence of a break-in. Paintbrushes broken, papers torn, the children's portfolio of progress artwork destroyed, with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what they were attacking. Isabella knelt among the wreckage, her hands trembling as she picked up fragments of Marco's architectural drawings, scraps of Sophia's musical paintings, pieces of Lucia's family portraits that chronicled their journey from silence to voice. 18 months of therapeutic progress, documented and preserved with the care of someone who understood that healing was fragile and needed to be protected. All of it destroyed. "Miss Martinez?" Maria Santos appeared in the studio doorway, her weathered face creased with concern as she surveyed the destruction. "Dios mio, what happened here?" Isabella forced herself to stand, professional composure warring with rage as she processed the implications of what she was seeing. This wasn't random vandalism. This was targeted psychological warfare designed to undermine her work, frighten the children, and send a message that her presence was unwelcome. "I don't know," Isabella said, though her mind was already calculating who had access to the children's wing, who understood the therapeutic significance of their artwork, who might view her success as a threat to existing power structures. But whoever did this knows exactly how to hurt us where it matters most. The children's reaction to discovering their destroyed artwork was devastating. Marco, who'd just begun expressing pride in his creative accomplishments, retreated into the geometric rigidity that had characterized his early trauma response. Sophia stopped humming, her musical confidence shattered by the realization that someone had deliberately destroyed her visual melodies. Lucia asked the question that broke Isabella's heart. "Did we do something wrong? Is that why someone hurt our pictures?" Isabella spent the morning helping them process the destruction while internally cataloguing every detail that might identify the perpetrator. The studio's security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned between midnight and 6 a.m. The building's motion sensors had been disabled through what the security team claimed was a system glitch. Even the backup power supply had failed, leaving a convenient 8-hour window where the children's creative sanctuary had been vulnerable. Too many coincidences, too much precision. Someone with intimate knowledge of the estate's security protocols had orchestrated this attack. That afternoon, Isabella discovered that her latest therapeutic innovation, a sensory communication board designed to help trauma-affected children express complex emotions, had been rejected by the medical supply company that had promised delivery the previous week. The rejection cited concerns about the practitioner's credentials and the experimental nature of the requested equipment. Isabella had never disclosed her work with experimental therapeutic techniques to anyone outside the Romano family. The medical supply company's knowledge of her methods suggested that someone had been monitoring her professional activities, gathering information that could be used to undermine her credibility. By evening, 3 more incidents had occurred: a scheduled consultation with Dr. Elizabeth Santos, the child psychologist at Mount Sinai who'd been providing professional validation for Isabella's techniques, was cancelled due to questions about the therapeutic environment's safety protocols. Isabella's application for certification in art therapy, which had been progressing smoothly for 2 months, was suddenly flagged for additional review of practitioner background and methodology. Most damaging of all, Carmen Martinez's medical team received an anonymous tip suggesting that Isabella might be exploiting her elderly foster mother's dementia for financial gain, triggering a formal investigation by Adult Protective Services that would require extensive documentation and could result in Carmen being removed from Isabella's care. Each incident, taken individually, could be explained as bureaucratic incompetence or unfortunate timing. Together, they formed a pattern of systematic sabotage designed to isolate Isabella professionally, undermine her therapeutic work, and threaten her family stability. Isabella sat in Vincenzo's study at 11 p.m., surrounded by documentation of the day's attacks, while he reviewed business reports that seemed trivial compared to the assault on their family's foundation. She'd waited until the children were asleep to present her findings, understanding that their security depended on adult conversations happening outside their awareness. It's coordinated," she said, spreading incident reports across his desk like evidence in a criminal investigation. "Someone with access to our household information, knowledge of my professional activities, and connections to multiple bureaucratic systems. This isn't random harassment, Vincenzo. This is a campaign designed to destroy everything we've built. Vincenzo studied the documentation with the focused attention of a man who'd spent 15 years identifying threats and calculating responses. His expression revealed nothing, but Isabella recognized the stillness that indicated dangerous calculations were being made. "Who has access to this information?" she asked. "Household staff, family members, security personnel, medical team, legal advisors?" Vincenzo's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes had hardened into the cold authority that reminded Isabella she was engaged to one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast. "And Angelo, who coordinates all of the above. Angelo Torino." The name hung between them like an accusation neither wanted to voice directly. Angelo, who'd been Vincenzo's lieutenant for 15 years. Angelo, who'd expressed subtle disapproval of Isabella's presence since her arrival. Angelo, whose protective instincts seemed increasingly focused on protecting the family from Isabella, rather than protecting Isabella as part of the family. "You think he's behind this?" Isabella asked. "I think Angelo believes he's protecting us from a threat he perceives but can't articulate." Vincenzo closed the reports and looked directly at Isabella, his expression softening from criminal authority to loving concern. "He's watched too many people try to get close to this family for the wrong reasons. He doesn't understand that you're here for the right ones." Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening's autumn air. "What happens if he decides I'm too dangerous to tolerate?" Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that extended beyond relationship dynamics into territory where loyalty and love might conflict in ways that could prove fatal. Angelo wasn't just an employee, he was family, chosen brotherhood forged through shared danger and absolute trust. But Isabella had become family too, legally and emotionally, mother to Vincenzo's children and partner in building their future. "Then we'll have a conversation about boundaries, respect, and the consequences of threatening what matters most to me." Vincenzo's voice carried the quiet menace that suggested such conversations in his world involved more than words. "But first, we need proof. Suspicion isn't enough to act on." As if summoned by their discussion, Angelo's voice carried from the foyer, speaking in urgent tones to someone Isabella couldn't identify. She moved to the study window and saw 3 black SUVs in the circular driveway, their engines running and doors open in the configuration that suggested immediate departure rather than arrival. "Boss?" Angelo appeared in the study doorway, his expression carrying the controlled urgency that characterized crisis management. "We have a situation. The Torino family meeting has been moved again. Tonight. They're claiming intelligence about a federal investigation that requires immediate coordination." Isabella noticed that Angelo's explanation sounded rehearsed, delivered with the smooth confidence of someone who'd practiced justifications for moving Vincenzo away from the estate on short notice. She also noticed that his eyes never met hers, focusing exclusively on Vincenzo as if she weren't present in the room. "Another emergency meeting," Vincenzo said, his tone revealing nothing about his suspicions. "How convenient." "Sir?" "Nothing. How long will this take?" "Several hours, possibly overnight. The situation is complex." Angelo's pause felt calculated, designed to convey significance without providing specifics that could be verified or questioned. "The cars are ready when you are." Vincenzo stood, his movement controlled but tense in ways that suggested internal conflict between duty and instinct. Isabella recognized that he was trapped between competing loyalties, his obligation to family business and his growing suspicion that the business was being used to manipulate him. "I'll come with you," Isabella said, understanding intuitively that separation was exactly what Angelo wanted to achieve. "That's not possible," Angelo replied immediately, his response too quick and too definitive. "This is strictly family business. Civilian presence would be inappropriate." Civilian. The word hung in the air like an insult, reducing Isabella's status from family member to outsider, despite her engagement, her role in the children's recovery, her integration into every aspect of their lives. Angelo's choice of language revealed his true perspective. She would always be an interloper, regardless of legal documents or emotional bonds. "Angelo's right," Vincenzo said reluctantly. "Some meetings require specific protocols, but I'll be back before the children wake up." As Isabella watched Vincenzo leave with Angelo and the waiting security detail, she felt the first real fear she'd experienced since joining the Romano family. Not physical fear, but the deeper terror of recognizing that forces beyond her control were working to destroy everything she'd found worth protecting. The children were asleep. Carmen was safe in the guest house under medical supervision. The household staff was loyal to Vincenzo rather than Angelo. But for the next several hours, Isabella would be alone, with her growing certainty that tonight's emergency was designed to remove Vincenzo from the estate while other plans were executed. Standing in the study window, watching tail lights disappear through the estate's security gates, Isabella began planning for possibilities she hoped would never materialize. If Angelo was orchestrating threats against her position in the family, tonight might be when those threats escalated from psychological harassment to something more direct. She moved through the house checking locks, verifying that the children's wing was secure, confirming that the estate's internal security systems were functioning properly. Then she settled into the family room with a clear view of all entrances, her phone charged and ready, her mind cataloguing every sound that might indicate unwelcome visitors. Outside, autumn wind rattled windows like fingers testing for weaknesses, and Isabella prepared to defend the family that had become her entire world. The attack came at 3:17 a.m., announced by the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen and the immediate silence of the estate's security system being cut from its power source. Isabella had been dozing fitfully in the family room armchair, her phone clutched in one hand and her other hand resting on the baseball bat she'd retrieved from Marco's sports equipment, when the unmistakable sounds of forced entry jolted her into terrifying clarity. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidental. This was exactly what she'd been dreading since Angelo's too convenient emergency had drawn Vincenzo away from the estate. Isabella moved through the darkened house with the silent precision that foster care had taught her, understanding that survival sometimes required invisibility and that protecting others sometimes required courage that felt impossible until it became necessary. The children were asleep in their wing, Carmen was sedated in the guest house, and the household security staff were conspicuously absent from their usual positions. Another piece of Angelo's orchestration. He'd arranged for Vincenzo to be away, for security to be compromised, for Isabella to be alone and vulnerable when his plan reached its violent conclusion. The kitchen window had been broken cleanly, professionally, by someone who understood how to disable alarm systems and bypass motion sensors. Isabella crept toward the sound of careful footsteps, her heart hammering so loudly she worried it might give away her position. Through the doorway, she could see 3 figures moving through the main floor with practiced efficiency, flashlights cutting precise beams through darkness as they searched for something specific. Or someone specific. "Upstairs," one of them whispered, his voice carrying the authority of someone directing an operation. "The woman and the kids make it look like a robbery gone wrong." Isabella's blood turned to ice as the implications hit her. This wasn't intimidation or harassment escalated to property damage. This was assassination disguised as home invasion, designed to eliminate her and potentially the children while providing Angelo with plausible deniability. Vincenzo would return to find his family destroyed by random violence, never suspecting that his most trusted lieutenant had orchestrated the tragedy. The men began moving toward the staircase that led to the children's wing. Isabella had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached Marco, Sophia and Lucia's bedrooms. 90 seconds to decide between hiding and hoping they'd overlook her, or taking action that could save her family but would almost certainly cost her life. She thought about Marco's architectural drawings, Sophia's musical paintings, Lucia's family portraits that included Isabella as a permanent member of their household. 3 children who'd found their voices through her patience and love, who called her Mama with the trust of souls who'd already lost one mother and couldn't survive losing another. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. Isabella moved through the kitchen with the speed of someone whose protective instincts had overridden self-preservation. She grabbed the largest chef's knife from the magnetic strip beside the stove, tested its weight in her hand, and positioned herself at the base of the stairs where the intruders would have to pass to reach the children. "You want them! You go through me!" she whispered to the darkness, her voice carrying the deadly calm that comes when fear transforms into fury. The first man appeared at the top of the stairs, his flashlight beam sweeping the hallway as he oriented himself toward the children's wing. He was dressed in black tactical gear, moving with the confidence of someone who expected no resistance from a civilian woman armed with kitchen implements. He was wrong. Isabella struck from below, driving the chef's knife upward into his thigh with enough force to sever the femoral artery. He dropped immediately, his scream echoing through the house as he fell down the stairs in a cascade of blood and panic that alerted his partners to the presence of armed resistance. "Contact! Woman's armed! Repeat, target is armed and dangerous." The second man appeared at the staircase with his weapon drawn, scanning for the threat that had eliminated his partner. Isabella had already moved, pressing herself against the wall where shadows provided concealment, and the angle would force him to expose himself completely before he could target her position. When he descended far enough to clear the upper landing, Isabella exploded from concealment with the kind of focused violence that survival sometimes required. The knife found his kidney before he could process her attack, and his weapon clattered down the stairs as he collapsed in shock and rapidly spreading blood loss. 2 down, 1 remaining. But the third man had heard the combat, understood that his mission had encountered unexpected resistance, and adapted his approach accordingly. Instead of coming down the stairs into Isabella's killing zone, she heard him moving through the upper hallway toward the children's bedrooms. He was going to use them as hostages, or worse. Isabella took the stairs 3 at a time, her bare feet silent on carpeted steps as adrenaline transformed fear into the kind of superhuman focus that mothers experienced when their children were threatened. She reached the upper landing as the third intruder was forcing open Lucia's bedroom door, his weapon trained on a 6-year-old who was sitting up in bed, confused and terrified by the sounds of violence that had awakened her. "Don't move," the man commanded, his voice carrying the professional calm of someone accustomed to controlling situations through intimidation. "Call down to your friend. Tell her to come up here slowly, or the kid gets hurt." Lucia's eyes found Isabella in the hallway shadow, wide with fear, but also with the trust of a child who'd learned that Isabella could solve problems that seemed impossible. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She simply waited for Isabella to fix this, the way Isabella had fixed their silence, their trauma, their family. Isabella," Lucia whispered, her voice small but steady. "Are you going to save us?" The question broke Isabella's heart and crystallized her resolve simultaneously. This child had already survived her mother's death, 18 months of psychological mutism, and the slow process of learning to trust the world again. She would not survive losing another mother to violence, especially violence that was meant for Isabella herself. "Yes, baby," Isabella replied, her voice carrying absolute certainty despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "I'm going to save you." Isabella stepped into the bedroom doorway, the bloody chef's knife still gripped in her right hand, her left hand raised in apparent surrender. The gunman's attention focused on her completely, his weapon shifting from Lucia to the woman who'd just eliminated 2 trained killers with kitchen implements and maternal fury. "Drop the knife," he ordered. Isabella dropped it. Then she lunged forward, not toward the weapon, but toward the man holding it, understanding that close-quarters combat was her only advantage against superior firepower. Her tackle carried them both to the floor in a tangle of limbs and desperation, the gun discharging into the ceiling as they fought for control. The struggle lasted perhaps 20 seconds, though it felt like hours of life or death grappling where every movement could determine whether Lucia lived or died. Isabella fought with the kind of primal savagery that came from absolute necessity, using teeth, nails, and the leverage of someone defending the most important thing in her world. When the gun went off again, Isabella felt the bullet's heat pass close enough to her face that she could smell burned powder. But the weapon was pointing away from Lucia, away from the other children's bedrooms, away from everything that mattered more than Isabella's own survival. She managed to wrap her hands around the gunman's throat, pressing her thumbs into his windpipe with the methodical pressure of someone who understood that some threats could only be eliminated permanently. His struggles weakened. His grip on consciousness faded. His efforts to reach his weapon became increasingly desperate and uncoordinated. When he stopped moving, Isabella held her position for another full minute, ensuring that the threat was neutralized completely before releasing pressure and rolling away from his still form. 3 men had entered her home intending to murder her family. 3 men would not be leaving alive. The silence that followed was broken by small voices calling from the other bedrooms as Marco and Sophia, awakened by gunshots and sounds of struggle, began crying for Isabella and Papa and safety that felt very far away. Isabella gathered all 3 children into Lucia's bedroom, checking them for injuries, while her own hands shook with adrenaline crash and the recognition of what she'd just done. She'd killed 3 people. With her bare hands and kitchen utensils, she'd eliminated threats to her family in ways that would have consequences beyond tonight's immediate crisis. But the children were alive, unharmed, safe. "Are the bad men gone?" Marco asked, his 6-year-old mind trying to process violence that no child should witness. "Yes," Isabella said firmly. "The bad men are gone. They can't hurt us anymore." "Are you hurt?" Sophia wanted to know, her musician's sensitivity picking up on the blood that stained Isabella's clothes and hands. "I'm fine, baby, just tired." "Will Papa come home soon?" Lucia asked, the question that mattered most, because Papa meant protection that could handle problems too big for even Isabella to solve. Isabella was reaching for her phone to call Vincenzo when she heard vehicle engines in the estate's driveway, multiple cars arriving with the urgency that suggested either rescue or the next wave of attack. She moved to the window and saw familiar black SUVs, but also unfamiliar tactical vehicles that made her heart race with new terror. Had Angelo sent backup? Were there more assassins coming to finish what the first team had failed to complete? Then she saw Vincenzo emerging from the lead vehicle, his face a mask of controlled rage as he surveyed evidence of forced entry, and immediately began shouting orders to security personnel who moved through the estate like an invasion force securing hostile territory. He'd returned. Somehow he'd realized the danger and returned in time to clean up the aftermath, if not prevent the attack itself. Isabella's phone buzzed with a text message that made her understand exactly what had happened. "Boss, found the tracking device Angelo planted on your car. Also found recordings of his conversations with Torino family enemies. He's been selling information for 6 months. Consider him permanently retired. Tony." Angelo's betrayal was complete, exposed, and had been resolved through methods that Isabella preferred not to understand. But his final gambit, using assassins to eliminate Isabella while Vincenzo was away, had failed because Isabella had fought back with the desperate courage of someone protecting the only family she'd ever chosen. The danger was over. The children were safe. Angelo would never threaten their happiness again. But as Isabella sat in Lucia's bedroom, surrounded by 3 traumatized children and the bodies of men she'd killed to protect them, she understood that some victories came with costs that would take years to fully comprehend. 6 months later, Isabella Romano stood in the kitchen of Nonna Rosa's Italian restaurant, not as a waitress struggling to pay her foster mother's medical bills, but as the woman whose courage had saved 3 children's lives and whose love had transformed a broken family into something stronger than it had ever been before. The same kitchen where she'd once arrived at 4:47 a.m. to prep coffee and clean tables now welcomed her as an honoured guest, here to celebrate the anniversary of the day 3 silent children had first found their voices. The changes were remarkable, visible in ways both subtle and profound. Isabella wore a tailored dress that spoke of security and confidence, her engagement ring catching afternoon light as she helped Maria Santos prepare the feast that would celebrate not just recovery, but transformation. Her hair was styled professionally, her posture carried the authority of someone who'd discovered her own strength, and her smile held the contentment of a woman who'd found her place in the world through the most unlikely circumstances imaginable. But the most significant change was audible. The dining room echoed with the clear, confident voices of 3 children who spoke with the fluency of recovery and the excitement of futures that felt limitless. "Isabella, Marco's trying to explain architectural engineering to Mrs. Chen again," Sophia called from booth 7, her voice carrying the musical laughter that had become her signature sound. "She's very polite, but I think she just wants to eat her minestrone in peace." "Marco, remember what we discussed about reading your audience?" Isabella replied, her tone carrying the gentle authority of someone who'd learned to balance therapeutic guidance with maternal affection. "Not everyone shares your passion for structural mathematics." "But Isabella, the load-bearing beam calculations are fascinating," Marco protested, his 6-year-old voice serious with the intensity that characterized his approach to everything he found interesting. "Mrs. Chen said she was curious about how buildings stay up." She said, "Oh, that's nice, dear," when you asked if she wanted to hear about load-bearing beams, Lucia corrected with the diplomatic accuracy that had made her the family's unofficial translator between Marco's enthusiasms and social reality. "That's not the same as curious." Isabella smiled, listening to the kind of sibling interaction that had seemed impossible 18 months ago when these same children had communicated only through silence and artistic expression. Now they debated, negotiated, teased each other, and filled every space with the kind of noise that transformed houses into homes. The occasion for today's celebration was bittersweet perfection. 1 year ago, Isabella had served the Romano family their first meal at this same table, offering them crayons and paper placemats that had become the foundation for miraculous recovery. Today, she was here as Mrs. Isabella Romano, married to Vincenzo for 3 months, and legal mother to 3 children, who called her Mama, with the confidence of souls who'd never doubted her permanent place in their lives. Giuseppe Romano emerged from his kitchen carrying the special meal he'd prepared for the anniversary. Spaghetti carbonara made with the exact recipe Elena had loved, osso buco prepared with techniques passed down through 4 generations of his family, and bread baked fresh that morning, with the care reserved for occasions that mattered beyond profit or routine. 1 year, Giuseppe said, his Italian accent thick with emotion as he surveyed the family that had returned to his restaurant transformed beyond recognition. 1 year since 3 silent bambini found their voices in my dining room. Now look at them, listen to them. The children were indeed worth listening to. Marco was explaining to Lucia his latest architectural project, a playhouse designed with geometric precision but incorporating her suggestions for artistic flourishes that would make it beautiful as well as structurally sound. Sophia was humming a melody she'd composed that morning, her musical development having progressed to the point where she was taking formal piano lessons and showing remarkable natural talent. Lucia was sketching the restaurant's interior in a notebook she carried everywhere, her artistic eye capturing details that revealed her continuing visual processing of the world around her. But perhaps most remarkably, they were all talking, constantly, questions about everything they observed, opinions about everything they experienced, stories about everything they remembered or imagined. 18 months of accumulated thoughts and feelings had found their voices, creating a conversational symphony that never ceased to amaze Isabella. Vincenzo entered through the restaurant's front door with the relaxed confidence of a man whose most important worries had been resolved. He'd aged in the past year, but positively, the stress lines around his eyes softening into laugh lines earned through daily joy rather than accumulated through crisis management. His embrace of Isabella was automatic, comfortable, the kind of physical affection that spoke of security rather than passion, though passion remained very much present in their private moments. "How are my favourite people?" he asked, settling into the booth beside Isabella, while the children competed to tell him about their morning's adventures. "We helped Isabella make bread for tonight's dinner," Lucia announced. "My hands are still covered in flour, see?" "I calculated the proper kneading time based on gluten development rates," Marco added, because every activity in his world contained opportunities for mathematical analysis. "And I composed a song about bread rising," Sophia concluded, immediately beginning to hum a melody that somehow captured the patient transformation of ingredients into sustenance. Isabella watched Vincenzo's face as he listened to his children, seeing the wonder that still amazed him daily. The silence that had defined their family for 18 months had been replaced by such abundant communication that quiet moments were rare and precious. But the noise was joyful, purposeful, evidence of minds that were healing and hearts that felt safe enough to express themselves without reservation. Dr. Mitchell's latest evaluation had confirmed what everyone could observe. The children's recovery was complete. Not just their verbal communication, but their emotional processing, their social development, their academic progress. They'd not only returned to their pre-trauma baseline, but had exceeded it, demonstrating resilience that spoke to the strength they'd inherited from their parents and the healing they'd received through Isabella's patient intervention. The anniversary meal proceeded with the kind of celebratory chaos that large families generated when everyone wanted to share their thoughts simultaneously. Stories about school, questions about upcoming vacation plans, debates about which movie to watch for family night. Normal conversation that felt miraculous because of how long it had been absent. But the meal's centerpiece was the surprise that Isabella and Vincenzo had planned together, as Giuseppe brought dessert, gelato made with Elena's favourite flavours. Isabella stood and raised her water glass in a toast that made everyone at the table focus their attention on her words. "1 year ago, I was a waitress who thought she understood what family meant," Isabella began, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. "I was wrong. Family isn't just about who loves you. It's about who fights for you, who believes in your potential when you can't see it yourself, and who creates space for you to become the person you're meant to be." The children listened with the focused attention they'd learned to give important moments, understanding instinctively that some speeches deserved complete silence. "Marco, Sophia and Lucia taught me that communication takes many forms, that healing happens on its own timeline, and that the bravest thing anyone can do is trust another person with their broken places." Isabella paused, looking at each child individually before continuing. "They also taught me that some families are born and some families are chosen, and chosen families can be just as strong as any other kind." Vincenzo squeezed her hand, understanding that this speech was as much about their future as their past. "Which is why your papa and I want to tell you something important." Isabella smiled, the expression carrying anticipation rather than anxiety. "In about 6 months, you're going to have a little brother or sister. We're having a baby." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before exploding into excited questions, celebratory cheers, and the kind of immediate planning that characterized the Romano children's approach to any significant change. Marco wanted to know about nursery architecture. Sophia began composing lullabies. Lucia started sketching family portraits that included an additional small figure. Giuseppe wiped tears from his weathered cheeks as he watched a family that had survived loss, trauma, and recovery now preparing to welcome new life. The booth that had witnessed 18 months of silence, followed by gradual healing, was now filled with voices planning for a future that promised only growth and love. As the celebration continued around her, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought her from invisible waitress to beloved wife and mother. She thought about Carmen, now stable and content in her care facility, surrounded by medical attention and visited daily by grandchildren who called her abuela. She thought about her volunteer work at the Children's Crisis Centre, where her techniques were now being studied by professionals nationwide. She thought about the academic papers she was co-authoring about art therapy and trauma recovery, work that might help other families find their way back from silence. But mostly, she thought about the 3 children who'd taught her that love multiplied rather than divided, that patience could work miracles, and that some transformations were worth risking everything to achieve. Outside Nonna Rosa's windows, autumn rain began falling on the streets of Little Italy, but inside a family sat together in booth 7, their voices filling the space with the kind of sound that transforms restaurants into sanctuaries, strangers into family, and broken silence into healing song. The waitress was gone. Long live the Queen. The kitchen of Nonna Rosa's came alive at 4:47 a.m. every Tuesday morning, when Isabella Martinez pushed through the service entrance with her shoulder, juggling 2 canvas bags of cleaning supplies and a thermos of coffee that would have to sustain her until the lunch rush ended. The restaurant held that peculiar stillness of a place waiting to be awakened, all stainless steel surfaces gleaming under fluorescent lights and prep stations arranged with the precision of an operating theatre. Isabella had been arriving 13 minutes early for 8 months, not because management demanded it, but because those 13 minutes belonged entirely to her. She could move through Giuseppe's kitchen without the chaos of line cooks shouting orders, without Marie Delacroix barking criticisms about her table service, without the relentless pressure of customers who saw her uniform but never her face. In those quiet moments before the restaurant opened, Isabella could remember what it felt like to be visible. She tied her dark hair back with the same elastic band she'd been using for 3 weeks, checked her reflection in the polished chrome of the industrial refrigerator, and began the morning ritual that had become as automatic as breathing. Prep the coffee station, check the bread delivery, verify that the previous night's cleaning crew had properly sanitized the dining room tables. Small tasks, invisible tasks, but tasks that kept Nonna Rosa's running smoothly while everyone else took the credit. Isabella Martinez had learned the art of invisibility in foster care, where drawing attention meant risking placement changes, angry caseworkers, and the constant threat of separation from the few people who'd shown her kindness. At 28, she perfected the skill. Customers looked through her as if she were part of the furniture. Her supervisor Marie treated her like a replaceable component in the restaurant's machinery. Even Giuseppe, who owned the place and prided himself on treating employees like family, rarely remembered her name despite her working there for 2 years. But invisibility had its advantages. It meant she could observe without being observed, listen without being questioned, study people with the intensity of a doctoral candidate researching human behaviour, filing away every detail about their habits, their fears, their unspoken needs. Like the Romano family, who arrived every Tuesday at exactly 2:30 p.m. and sat in booth 7 near the window that faced Mulberry Street. Isabella had been watching them for 8 months, not stalking, not prying, just noticing with the same careful attention she paid to all her regular customers. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop always ordered minestrone soup and left exactly 15% tip because her arthritis made calculating difficult. Mr. Goldberg requested extra breadsticks because he fed half of them to pigeons on his walk home. The teenage couple who came in Saturday nights split a single entree and 2 sodas because they were saving money for a promise ring. But the Romano family was different. They carried silence like other families carried conversation. The father, Vincenzo, possessed the kind of dangerous elegance that made other diners unconsciously lower their voices when he entered. His children, 3 beautiful 6-year-olds with their mother's delicate features and their father's watchful eyes, sat with the stillness of museum statues. and every week Vincenzo would order the same meals, watch his children not eat them, and leave a tip that was larger than Isabella's daily wage. The first time she'd served their table, Marie had pulled her aside with the kind of urgent whisper reserved for dire warnings. "That's Vincenzo Romano," she'd hissed, her French accent making the name sound like a curse. "You don't ask questions, you don't make conversation, you bring food, you clear plates, you stay invisible. Understand?" Isabella understood perfectly. She'd recognised the signs of dangerous money from her first glimpse of Vincenzo's tailored suit and the way other customers avoided making eye contact. But she'd also recognised something else, something that Marie and the other servers missed entirely because they were too busy being afraid. The children were lost, not physically lost. They were surrounded by protection, clearly loved, obviously cared for, with every luxury money could provide. But emotionally, psychologically, they were wandering in a wilderness that their father couldn't navigate. Isabella had seen that particular kind of lostness before. She'd worn it herself for 2 years after her 7th birthday, when the system had moved her to her 3rd foster home, and something inside her had simply stopped working. She'd stopped speaking at age 7, not from physical trauma, not from abuse, just from the accumulated weight of being unwanted, unheard, unseen. Words had felt pointless when no one listened. Communication had seemed futile when every adult in her life treated her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood. The silence had lasted 26 months. Carmen Martinez, her 4th foster mother, had been the one to crack the code, not through therapy or medical intervention, but through art. Carmen had been a retired elementary school teacher who understood that some children's voices lived in their hands rather than their throats. She'd given Isabella sketchbooks, watercolours, modelling clay, and most importantly, time. Time to express what couldn't be spoken, time to heal without pressure, time to remember that communication took many forms. Isabella's voice had returned gradually, like winter ice melting into spring streams. First whispers, then normal conversation, then eventually the confidence to speak up for herself when it mattered. But she'd never forgotten the landscape of silence, the way it felt to be trapped inside your own mind while the world moved forward without you. Watching the Romano children, Isabella recognised the territory. She'd been collecting evidence for months. Marco's obsession with symmetry and geometric patterns suggested a need for control in a world that felt chaotic. Sophia's rhythmic tapping indicated musical intelligence seeking expression through alternative channels. Lucia's careful observation of reflections and shadows revealed an artist's eye studying the world through indirect angles. These weren't broken children. They were communicating children using a language that the adults around them didn't speak. Isabella had spent her Tuesday evenings at the Queen's Public Library researching everything she could find about childhood selective mutism, trauma-induced communication disorders, and alternative therapeutic approaches. She'd read case studies, academic papers, and first-person accounts from children who'd found their way back to speech. She'd filled 2 composition notebooks with techniques, theories, and possible interventions. Not because she planned to approach the Romano family. That would be presumptuous, dangerous, and probably fatal. But because understanding their situation helped her process her own childhood trauma, and because watching them gave her a sense of purpose that her regular job couldn't provide. This morning, however, felt different. Isabella couldn't identify why, but something in the restaurant's atmosphere had shifted. Giuseppe was humming while he prepared the daily specials, his usual Tuesday melancholy replaced by anticipatory energy. Marie was checking the schedule repeatedly as if expecting changes. Even the morning prep crew seemed more focused than usual. Isabella finished her opening tasks and moved into the dining room to prepare table setups. She paused at booth 7, the Romano family's preferred location, and felt that familiar tightness in her chest. In 6 hours, those 3 silent children would sit in these chairs, arrange objects in patterns that meant everything to them and nothing to anyone else, and leave with their voices still locked away. But today, for reasons she couldn't articulate, Isabella found herself placing the standard table setting with unusual care. She aligned the silverware with mathematical precision. She folded the cloth napkins into perfect triangles. She even adjusted the salt and pepper shakers so they created a small geometric pattern that Marco might appreciate. Then she did something she'd never done before. She placed 3 crayons on the table. Not obviously, not presumptively, but discreetly tucked beside the bread basket where curious children might notice them. Red, blue, and yellow, primary colours, the building blocks of every other hue in the spectrum. Isabella stepped back and surveyed her work. To any other server, booth 7 looked exactly like every other table in the restaurant, but hidden in the standard setup were tools, possibilities, an invitation written in a language that didn't require words. She glanced at the kitchen clock. 5 hours until the Romano family arrived. 5 hours to decide whether she was being helpful or insane. 5 hours to prepare for what might be the most important Tuesday of her life. Outside, the morning rain had stopped, leaving Mulberry Street gleaming like a promise under the early sun. Inside Nonna Rosa's, Isabella Martinez finished her prep work and tried to ignore the feeling that everything was about to change. At precisely 2:30 p.m, the front door of Nonna Rosa's opened with the soft chime of arrival bells, and Isabella's carefully constructed Tuesday routine shattered like glass against concrete. Vincenzo Romano entered first, his charcoal suit immaculate despite the afternoon humidity, his dark eyes scanning the dining room with the methodical precision of a man who'd survived 15 years in a business where carelessness meant death. Behind him came the children, moving in the careful formation that had become their signature. Marco on the left, Lucia in the centre, Sophia on the right, their small hands linked together like paper dolls cut from the same tragic pattern. Isabella watched from behind the coffee station, her pulse accelerating with each step they took toward booth 7. She'd replayed this moment in her mind dozens of times over the past 5 hours, but reality carried a weight that imagination couldn't duplicate. These weren't theoretical subjects for her amateur research. They were real children trapped in real silence, and she was about to either help them or make everything worse. Marie Delacroix appeared at Isabella's elbow with the supernatural timing of a woman who'd built her career on reading customer dynamics. "Table 7, she said, her French accent sharp with authority. "You're covering for Denise today." Isabella's throat constricted. In 8 months of watching the Romano family, she'd never been assigned to their table. That honour belonged to Denise Rodriguez, a veteran server with 20 years of experience and the kind of unflappable composure that dangerous customers appreciated. But Denise had called in sick with the flu, leaving Marie scrambling to reassign tables to her remaining staff. "Me?" Isabella's voice came out smaller than intended. Marie's eyes narrowed. "You have experience with difficult customers, no? Foster care teaches you to read people, yes? Then you understand what I'm telling you." She leaned closer, her perfume mixing with the scent of garlic from the kitchen. "These are not people who tolerate mistakes. You bring food, you clear plates, you stay invisible, nothing else." Isabella nodded, but her mind was already racing beyond Marie's warnings toward the 3 crayons she'd hidden beside the bread basket. What had seemed like harmless preparation 5 hours ago now felt like potential suicide. Vincenzo Romano was a man who controlled everything in his environment. Unauthorized changes to his children's routine might be interpreted as a threat, a presumption, or worse. But as Isabella approached booth 7 with menus clutched against her chest, she noticed something that made her forget every sensible concern about personal safety. Marco was already studying the geometric pattern she created with the salt and pepper shakers. His dark eyes moved between the objects with the focused intensity of a mathematician discovering a new theorem. His right hand twitched slightly, as if wanting to reach out and adjust their positioning. She'd been right. He understood patterns as language. "Good afternoon," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She looked directly at the children instead of defaulting to Vincenzo, a choice that violated every service protocol she'd been taught. "I'm Isabella. I'll be taking care of your table today." Vincenzo's attention sharpened like a blade finding its target. Most servers addressed him exclusively, treating his children like decorative accessories to be acknowledged with perfunctory politeness. Isabella's approach marked her as either naive or dangerous, and in Vincenzo's world both categories warranted careful observation. "The usual," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Spaghetti carbonara for the children, osso buco for me, house wine." Isabella nodded, but instead of retreating to place the order, she did something unprecedented. She knelt beside the table, bringing herself to the children's eye level, and slowly reached toward the breadbasket. Her movements were deliberate, non-threatening, telegraphed with the kind of careful intention that wild animals recognized as safe. "I thought you might like these," she said, revealing the 3 crayons she'd hidden earlier. "Sometimes it's easier to draw what we're thinking than to say it." The silence that followed was so complete that Isabella could hear the ice machine cycling in the kitchen, the distant murmur of conversation from other tables, the soft jazz playing through the restaurant's speaker system. Vincenzo's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the inside of his suit jacket, where Isabella suspected he kept a weapon. His bodyguards, positioned at strategic points throughout the dining room, tensed like hunting cats preparing to strike. But the children were transforming. Marco's eyes widened as he processed the offering, his mathematical mind calculating the possibilities that 3 primary colours could create. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her musician's fingers already moving in rhythm against the table's surface as if she were composing something invisible. Lucia simply stared at the crayons with the kind of wonder that suggested she was seeing magic materialize in the mundane world of Tuesday lunch. Then Marco did something extraordinary. He reached out, selected the blue crayon with the deliberate care of a surgeon choosing instruments, and began drawing on the white paper placemat. Not randomly, not childishly, but with focused intention. Geometric shapes emerged under his careful strokes. Triangles, squares, hexagons, all interconnected in a pattern that spoke of order, control, and mathematical beauty. Sophia watched her brother for exactly 30 seconds before claiming the red crayon and adding her own contribution to the growing artwork. But where Marco created rigid geometry, Sophia drew flowing lines that curved and danced across the paper like musical notation translated into visual form. Rhythm made visible. Lucia, the youngest, observed her siblings for nearly a full minute before selecting the yellow crayon. Her addition to their collaborative masterpiece was different again. Tiny human figures, carefully detailed despite their miniature size, positioned throughout Marco's geometric framework and Sophia's flowing rhythms, like actors finding their places on a stage. The entire creation took less than 5 minutes. When they finished, all 3 children sat back and looked at Isabella with expressions that seemed to say, "We told you something important. Did you understand?" Isabella studied their artwork with the intensity of an archaeologist deciphering ancient hieroglyphs, Marco's need for structure and predictability, Sophia's musical soul-seeking expression through alternative channels, Lucia's artistic eye and her deep understanding that life was about the people who filled the spaces between the structures and the songs. "This is beautiful," Isabella said, her voice soft with genuine appreciation. "Marco, your patterns remind me of the windows in St. Patrick's Cathedral. Sophia, these lines look like the sheet music I used to see when my foster mother played piano. And Lucia, these little people, they make everything else come alive." For the first time in 8 months of observation, Isabella saw the Romano children make direct eye contact with an adult who wasn't their father. Not just looking, but truly seeing her, recognizing that she understood their communication in ways that expensive therapists and medical specialists had failed to grasp. Vincenzo was staring at the interaction with an expression Isabella couldn't decipher. Surprise, certainly. Suspicion, probably. But underneath those predictable reactions, she detected something more dangerous. Hope. "You can keep this," she said, carefully tearing their placemat artwork free from the table. "I'll bring fresh placemats with your food." As Isabella stood to leave, Giuseppe Romano emerged from the kitchen, carrying their meals personally instead of sending them through the service window. His weathered face showed none of its usual Tuesday melancholy. Instead, he looked like a man witnessing a minor miracle. Isabella," he said, his Italian accent thick with emotion. "In 40 years of running this restaurant, I have never seen those children engage with anyone except their father." Behind her, Isabella could hear the soft scratch of crayons against fresh paper as the Romano children continued their artistic conversation. For the first time since she'd started working at Nonna Rosa's, the silence at booth 7 had been replaced by the quiet sounds of creation. Vincenzo Romano watched Isabella retreat toward the kitchen, his mind calculating variables that hadn't existed an hour ago. His children were drawing, actually engaging with a stranger through purposeful activity. The woman had spoken to them like they were intelligent beings rather than tragic curiosities, and they had responded with trust that seemed impossible given their history. When Isabella returned with their meals, she found that the children had created 3 separate drawings, each one building on the themes they'd established in their first collaborative effort. Marco had drawn a house with perfectly symmetrical windows and a precisely centered door. Sophia had added musical notes floating above the house like smoke from a chimney. Lucia had populated the scene with a family of stick figures, a tall man in a suit, 3 children holding hands, and a woman with long dark hair standing beside them. Isabella set their plates down with the careful attention to detail that Vincenzo had observed during his previous visits to the restaurant. But this time, instead of the efficient invisibility that characterized most service interactions, she moved with the deliberate mindfulness of someone participating in a sacred ritual. "Thank you," she said, speaking directly to the children again, "for sharing your drawings with me. They tell a beautiful story." As Isabella walked away, Vincenzo noticed that his children were eating, not just picking at their food out of obligation, but actually consuming their spaghetti carbonara with something approaching enthusiasm. Marco twirled his pasta into perfect cylinders before each bite. Sophia ate in rhythm, 4 bites followed by a pause, then 4 more bites. Lucia arranged her peas in small groups around the edge of her plate before eating them one group at a time. They were still silent. But for the first time in 18 months, they seemed present in their own lives. At the table's edge, 3 crayons lay beside 3 drawings, and Vincenzo Romano began to understand that some conversations didn't require words. The background check on Isabella Martinez arrived on Vincenzo Romano's desk at 9:17 a.m. Wednesday morning, delivered by Tony Marconi with the efficient discretion that had kept him alive in the intelligence business for 2 decades. The manila folder contained 43 pages of documentation that painted a picture more complex than Vincenzo had anticipated. Isabella Carmen Martinez. Born February 14, 1998, at Queen's General Hospital to Maria Santos Martinez, age 16, father unknown. Mother died of complications from pneumonia when Isabella was 3 years old. No known relatives willing or able to provide care. Ward of the state from age 3 to 18. Vincenzo read the clinical language of bureaucratic reports while his coffee grew cold, each line revealing another layer of loss that explained the quiet understanding he'd witnessed in Isabella's eyes. 4 foster placements in 5 years. The first family returned her after 6 months, citing behavioural difficulties. Code for a traumatised child acting out in the only ways available to small, powerless people. The second placement lasted 8 months before the foster father was arrested for tax evasion. The third lasted 2 weeks. Then came Carmen Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, who'd taken Isabella at age 7 and kept her until aging out of the system at 18. Carmen had been a retired elementary school teacher, a widow who'd specialised in children with communication disorders. According to the social services reports, Isabella had arrived at Carmen's home in a state of selective mutism that lasted 26 months. Vincenzo set down the file and walked to his office window, which offered a view of the East River and the Manhattan skyline beyond. His children's silence had lasted 18 months and counting. Isabella had experienced something similar and emerged whole. That wasn't coincidence, that was hope dressed as professional competence. Tony had been thorough. Isabella's academic records showed a 3.8 GPA at LaGuardia Community College, where she'd studied child development and psychology before financial pressures forced her to leave after 2 years. She'd worked at a children's crisis centre in Astoria, volunteering 15 hours per week while maintaining 3 part-time jobs. Her supervisor there, Dr. Rachel Chen, had written a recommendation letter describing Isabella's intuitive understanding of childhood trauma and exceptional ability to establish trust with non-verbal children. The most interesting discovery was buried on page 37. Isabella had developed what Dr. Chen called sensory communication bridging, a technique that used art, music, and tactile experiences to help traumatized children express emotions they couldn't verbalize. She'd successfully worked with 12 children over 18 months, helping 7 of them transition back to verbal communication. She wasn't just a waitress who'd gotten lucky with his children. She was someone who'd turned her own survival into expertise, her own healing into a calling. And she was working 3 minimum-wage jobs to support herself and an elderly foster mother while developing therapeutic techniques that could revolutionize childhood trauma treatment. Vincenzo returned to his desk and continued reading. Isabella's financial situation was precarious but not desperate. She earned $1,847 per month from her combined jobs, paid $950 in rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in Astoria that she shared with Carmen Martinez, now 73 and showing early signs of dementia. Medical bills for Carmen's care consumed most of Isabella's remaining income. No criminal record, no drug use, no associations with questionable individuals. The only red flag in the entire report was a parking ticket from 2 months ago that she paid late, probably because she'd needed the $47 for something more urgent. Tony knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 15 years of absolute loyalty. "What do you think, boss?" Vincenzo closed the file and studied his lieutenant's face. Tony Marconi had been running background checks since before the internet existed. He could read a person's entire life story from credit reports, employment records, and social media activity. If he'd found something concerning about Isabella Martinez, it would have been highlighted in red ink on the first page. "She's exactly what she appears to be," Vincenzo said, "which in our world is either very rare or very dangerous." "My assessment too, but boss, there's something else you should know." Tony pulled a tablet from his briefcase and opened a video file. Security footage from yesterday's incident at the restaurant. The screen showed Nonna Rosa's dining room from an angle that captured booth 7 clearly. Vincenzo watched himself and the children enter, settle into their usual seats, and begin their Tuesday ritual of ordered silence. Then Isabella appeared in the frame, approaching their table with visible nervousness but unmistakable determination. What struck Vincenzo wasn't what he'd already witnessed: the crayons, the children's response, their unprecedented engagement. What struck him was Isabella's body language before she'd reached their table. She'd paused near the kitchen entrance, taken 3 deep breaths, and squared her shoulders like someone preparing for battle. This hadn't been spontaneous kindness, it had been calculated courage. "She planned this," Vincenzo said. "Gets better. I pulled footage from the past 8 weeks. She's been watching your table every Tuesday, taking notes during her breaks, researching something on her phone between orders. She's been studying your children, boss, learning their patterns." In most contexts, that information would have triggered immediate and violent consequences. In Vincenzo's world, unauthorized surveillance was a capital offence. But watching Isabella's careful observation of his children felt different from stalking or intelligence gathering. It felt like a teacher studying struggling students, trying to understand how to help them. "She's been preparing to help them," Vincenzo said, the realization carrying weight that surprised him. "For months." Tony nodded. "Question is, what do you want to do about it?" Vincenzo turned back to the window, where morning sunlight was turning the East River into molten silver. His children had eaten their entire lunch yesterday for the first time in memory. They'd engaged with a stranger through purposeful activity. They'd created art that communicated more about their inner lives than 18 months of expensive therapy had revealed, and the woman responsible for this miracle was working 3 jobs to pay medical bills for an elderly foster mother while developing techniques that could help other families like his. "I want to offer her a job," Vincenzo said. Tony's eyebrows rose slightly. "What kind of job?" "The kind that pays enough to solve her financial problems and gives her the resources she needs to help my children." Vincenzo returned to his desk and opened his laptop. "And I want it done right, not as charity, as a professional arrangement between equals." "Boss, with respect, she's a waitress from Queens. You're talking about bringing a civilian into our household, around your children, with access to family information that could get her killed if it falls into the wrong hands." Vincenzo looked at Tony with the patience of a man who'd been explaining obvious things to loyal but sometimes obtuse subordinates for 15 years. "My children haven't spoken in 18 months. Yesterday they communicated with a stranger through art for the first time since the accident. They ate their food. They made eye contact. They engaged with the world." He paused, letting the weight of those achievements settle. If Isabella Martinez can accomplish that in one afternoon with crayons and paper placemats, what do you think she could do with proper resources and time? Tony was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "You think she could get them talking again?" "I think she already is talking to them in a language they understand." Vincenzo pulled up Isabella's work schedule from the restaurant's employee database, another small invasion of privacy that Tony had provided without being asked. "She works doubles on Wednesdays and Fridays, single shifts Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sundays off for volunteer work at the Children's Centre." "You want me to approach her?" "No, this needs to come from me, personal, direct, with enough respect to acknowledge what she's already done and enough compensation to reflect what she could do." Vincenzo closed the laptop and reached for his phone. "Set up a meeting, tomorrow evening, after her shift ends, somewhere neutral, Giuseppe's back office at the restaurant." Tony made notes on his tablet. "What kind of offer are we talking about?" Vincenzo had been calculating numbers while reviewing Isabella's financial situation. 15,000 per month, health insurance for her and Carmen, relocation assistance to a secure apartment, access to any resources she needs for therapeutic work with the children. He paused. "And complete autonomy in developing her treatment approach. No interference from family members, no pressure to produce results on artificial timelines." "That's more than most of your lieutenants make." "Most of my lieutenants can't do what she did yesterday." Vincenzo stood and walked to the safe behind his desk, removing a business card from a locked drawer. "Dr. Elizabeth Santos, child psychologist at Mount Sinai. She's been trying to help the children since the accident. I want her to review Isabella's techniques, provide professional validation, maybe formal training if Isabella wants it." Tony pocketed the card. "And if she says no to the job offer?" "Then we make sure she has everything she needs to continue helping other children through her volunteer work, anonymous donations to the crisis centre, medical coverage for Carmen, scholarship money if she wants to finish her degree." Vincenzo returned to the window, watching tugboats guide cargo ships toward the Atlantic. "Either way, she doesn't struggle financially while doing work this important." "You realise you're talking about a woman you've had exactly one conversation with?" Vincenzo smiled, remembering the way Isabella had knelt beside his children's table with the careful reverence of someone approaching something sacred. "Tony, in our business, you learn to recognize quality quickly. Isabella Martinez has something that can't be taught, can't be bought, and can't be faked. She sees my children as complete human beings, worthy of patience and understanding. In 18 months, she's the first person outside our family who's managed that. And if this goes wrong, if she can't deliver what you're hoping for, then my children will have spent time with someone who treats them with dignity and kindness. That alone is worth the investment." Vincenzo picked up the background check file and handed it to Tony. "Make the arrangements, and Tony, make sure she understands this isn't charity. This is recognition of professional expertise." As Tony left to execute his orders, Vincenzo returned to his computer and began researching something he'd never thought he'd need to know: the academic requirements for certification in art therapy and childhood trauma treatment. If Isabella Martinez was going to help his children find their voices, he wanted to make sure she had every tool and credential necessary to do the job properly. Outside his window, the morning had transformed into afternoon, and somewhere in Queens, a waitress was finishing her shift, while 3 silent children waited for their next Tuesday visit to the place where someone had finally heard them speaking. Thursday evening arrived with the kind of gentle autumn rain that turned New York streets into mirrors, reflecting neon promises and broken dreams. Isabella Martinez stood outside Nonna Rosa's at 9:47 p.m., 13 minutes after her shift had ended, staring at the message that had changed everything. "Miss Martinez, I would like to speak with you about my children. Tonight, if possible. Giuseppe has offered his office. V. Romano." She'd read the text 47 times during her last hour of work, memorizing each word while mechanically refilling salt shakers and wiping down tables. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons this meeting could end badly. Vincenzo Romano was a dangerous man who operated by rules she didn't understand. She was a waitress from Queens who'd overstepped boundaries that might have consequences she couldn't imagine. But the children, Marco's careful geometric patterns, Sophia's musical rhythms translated into visual art, Lucia's tiny figures that populated their collaborative drawings like hope made tangible. Those 3 beautiful souls trapped in silence deserved every risk Isabella might be taking. Giuseppe Romano unlocked the restaurant's front door with the weary movements of a man who'd been serving other people's hunger for 4 decades. His weathered face showed none of the usual Tuesday melancholy that had characterized their previous interactions. Instead, he looked like someone who'd witnessed a miracle and was still processing its implications. "Isabella," he said, his Italian accent thick with emotion. 40 years I run this restaurant. 40 years I watch families come, eat, leave. But what you did with those children..." He shook his head, searching for words that didn't exist in any language. "Come, he's waiting." The back office smelled like espresso and old paper, filing cabinets lined against walls covered with photographs spanning decades of family celebrations. Isabella had never been in this space before, had never realized that Giuseppe's restaurant contained this intimate archive of community history. Wedding photos, baptism celebrations, graduation parties, all the moments when food became the centerpiece of human joy. Vincenzo Romano sat behind Giuseppe's desk with the natural authority of a man accustomed to controlling every environment he entered. But something about his posture suggested careful consideration rather than intimidation. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie loosened slightly, and his hands rested openly on the desk's surface rather than hidden in positions that might conceal weapons. "Miss Martinez, thank you for coming." His voice carried the same quiet authority she remembered from Tuesday's lunch, but without the edge of suspicion that had characterized their first interaction. "Please, sit." Isabella chose the chair across from him, her nursing scrubs rustling softly as she settled into the worn leather. She'd come directly from her Thursday evening shift at the Children's Crisis Centre, where she'd spent 3 hours helping a 7-year-old boy named Marcus work through his fear of speaking to adults. The parallel wasn't lost on her. "I want to talk to you about my children," Vincenzo said without preamble. "What you did on Tuesday, what they responded to, what it might mean for their recovery." Isabella had rehearsed this conversation during her subway ride from Astoria, preparing careful explanations about art therapy principles and trauma-informed communication strategies. But sitting across from Vincenzo Romano, she found herself abandoning professional jargon in favor of simple truth. "They're not broken," she said. "They're communicating perfectly, just not in the language that most adults expect to hear." Vincenzo's dark eyes sharpened with interest. "Explain." "Marco needs order in a world that feels chaotic. His geometric patterns aren't random drawings, they're architectural blueprints for emotional safety. Sophia processes the world through rhythm and music, so her visual patterns follow musical structures. Lucia sees relationships and connections that other people miss, which is why her drawings always include family units." Isabella leaned forward slightly, her passion for the subject overriding her nervousness about the audience. "They're telling you everything about their internal states. They're just using a visual vocabulary instead of a verbal one. And this is something you understand because—" The question hung in the air like a challenge and an invitation. Isabella realized that Vincenzo Romano had done his research, probably knew more about her background than she'd included on any job application. The acknowledgement was both terrifying and oddly respectful. He wasn't pretending ignorance about her qualifications. "Because I lived in that silence for 2 years," Isabella said. "After my mother died, after foster care, after everything stable in my world disappeared, I stopped talking. Not because I couldn't, but because words felt pointless when no one was really listening." "What brought you back?" "Carmen Martinez, my foster mother. She was a retired teacher who understood that some children's voices live in their hands instead of their throats." Isabella smiled, remembering the woman who'd saved her life through patient creativity. "She gave me sketchbooks, paints, modelling clay. She let me draw my feelings instead of forcing me to explain them. And slowly, when I felt safe enough to be heard, my voice came back." Vincenzo was quiet for a long moment, processing information with the careful attention of a man who'd built an empire on understanding human motivations. "You think the same approach could work with my children?" "I think it's already working. Tuesday wasn't a breakthrough, it was a translation. They've been trying to communicate all along, they just needed someone who spoke their language." "And you speak it?" "I'm fluent in silence," Isabella said simply, "which means I can teach them to be bilingual." The temperature in the room seemed to shift as Vincenzo leaned back in his chair, his expression revealing nothing about his internal calculations. Isabella waited, understanding instinctively that silence was her ally in this negotiation. Desperate people talk too much. Confident people let their competence speak first. "I want to offer you a position," Vincenzo said finally. "Working with my children, full-time, with the resources and support you need to develop whatever treatment approach you think will be most effective." Isabella's pulse accelerated, but she kept her expression neutral. "What kind of position?" "Family therapeutic specialist, $15,000 per month, health insurance for you and Carmen, relocation assistance to a secure apartment near our estate, access to any materials, equipment or training you need." Vincenzo paused, studying her reaction. "And complete autonomy in developing your treatment methods. No interference from family members. No pressure to produce results on artificial timelines." The offer was so far beyond anything Isabella had imagined that her first instinct was suspicion. In her experience, generous offers came with hidden costs that revealed themselves only after commitment had been made. But looking at Vincenzo's face, she saw something that surprised her. Vulnerability disguised as business pragmatism. "Why me?" she asked. "Because in 18 months of expensive specialists and therapeutic interventions, you're the first person who's gotten my children to engage, because you see them as complete human beings rather than problems to be solved, because you understand their language." Vincenzo's voice softened, almost imperceptibly. and because you know what it's like to find your way back from that kind of silence. Isabella thought about Carmen, whose dementia was progressing faster than expected, about the medical bills that consumed her income despite working 3 jobs, about the children at the crisis centre who needed advocates with proper training and resources, about Marco, Sophia and Lucia, who deserved someone who understood that healing happened on their timeline, not on adult expectations. "I want to maintain my volunteer work at the Children's Centre," she said, 2 days a week, "and I want to finish my degree in child psychology, if the schedule allows." "Done. We'll arrange for private tutoring if necessary, to accommodate both commitments. And Carmen comes with me. Whatever living arrangements you're offering, she's included. Non-negotiable." Vincenzo smiled, the expression transforming his face from intimidating to almost handsome. "Miss Martinez, anyone who can get my children to communicate after 18 months of silence has earned the right to make demands. Carmen is welcome. We'll arrange for private medical care if her condition requires it." Isabella extended her hand across the desk, meeting Vincenzo's eyes with the confidence of someone who'd survived worse odds and emerged stronger. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Romano." His hand was warm, calloused from years of work that predated his current position, and his grip conveyed respect rather than dominance. "When can you start?" "I need 2 weeks to give notice at my current jobs and make arrangements for Carmen's care during the transition." Isabella paused, already mentally organising the logistics of changing her entire life. "But I could start working with the children this Tuesday, if that's helpful. Gradually increase the hours while I transition out of my other responsibilities." "Perfect. My driver will pick you up at your apartment Monday morning to tour the estate and meet the household staff. We'll start slowly. Let everyone adjust to the new arrangement." Vincenzo stood, signalling the end of their formal negotiation. "Miss Martinez, I hope you understand what this means to my family." Isabella rose as well, gathering her purse while her mind raced through everything that would need to change over the next 2 weeks. "Mr. Romano, I hope you understand what this means to mine." As Giuseppe locked the restaurant behind them, Isabella walked toward the subway station through rain that felt like benediction rather than burden. In 2 weeks, she would wake up in a secure apartment with health insurance and financial stability. She would work with children who needed her specific expertise, using resources she'd never imagined having access to. She would help 3 beautiful souls find their voices while supporting Carmen's care and continuing her advocacy work. But tonight, she was still Isabella Martinez from Queens, who just negotiated her way into the kind of opportunity that could change everything. And for the first time in her adult life, the future felt like a promise instead of a threat. Behind her, Vincenzo Romano sat in his town car watching her disappear into the subway entrance, already planning the modifications that would need to be made to accommodate his family's newest member. Security protocols, background checks for Carmen's medical team, arrangements for Isabella's continuing education. All of it felt like preparation for hope, which was the most dangerous feeling a man in his position could entertain. But watching his children respond to Isabella's gentle expertise had reminded him that some risks were worth taking when the potential reward was hearing his children's voices again. The car pulled away from Nonna Rosa's, carrying Vincenzo through rain-slicked streets toward a future that suddenly seemed possible. The Romano estate revealed itself gradually as the armoured Mercedes navigated through layers of security that Isabella hadn't realised existed. First came the discreet checkpoint disguised as a landscaping company gate, where guards in civilian clothes verified their appointment through encrypted communication. Then the winding private road through what appeared to be a public park but was actually controlled territory, monitored by cameras hidden among the oak trees. Finally, the estate itself, a converted 1920s mansion that managed to look both welcoming and impregnable, surrounded by manicured grounds that could have graced the cover of Architectural Digest. Isabella pressed her face to the bulletproof window like a child visiting a castle, trying to process the reality of where she would be working. The main house was 3 stories of honey-coloured stone with ivy climbing the eastern wall, tall windows that promised rooms filled with natural light, and a circular driveway lined with rose bushes that someone clearly tended with obsessive care. It looked like old money trying to pretend it wasn't built on new violence. Tony Marconi, who'd introduced himself as Vincenzo's chief of security, opened her door with the courtesy of a man who understood that she was no longer a civilian to be managed, but a family employee to be protected. "Welcome to Romano Estate, Miss Martinez. Mr. Romano is waiting in the children's wing to give you the tour personally." The front entrance opened into a foyer that could have housed Isabella's entire Astoria apartment, complete with a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than she'd earned in the past 5 years. But the intimidating grandeur was tempered by practical details that revealed this was a home where children lived. A small wooden bench positioned perfectly for removing muddy shoes, colourful handprints preserved in a frame on the wall, and the faint scent of something baking in a kitchen that promised comfort rather than ceremony. Maria Santos emerged from what Isabella assumed was the kitchen, wiping flour-dusted hands on an apron that had seen decades of faithful service. She was a compact woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun, and eyes that assessed Isabella with the protective scrutiny of someone whose job was keeping children safe. "So you're the miracle worker," Maria said, her accent carrying traces of Puerto Rico softened by 40 years in Queens. "The one who got our babies to draw pictures." "I'm just someone who understands their language," Isabella replied, offering her hand with the respect due to someone who clearly ran the household's daily operations. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Santos." "Maria, and you'll do fine here if you remember that those children are the centre of everything. Not the boss's business, not his money, not his reputation. Just 3 little souls who need someone to see them clearly." Maria's grip was firm, testing Isabella's character through the honesty of calloused palms and steady eye contact. "Come, he's waiting." The children's wing occupied the entire 2nd floor of the east side, connected to the main house by a wide hallway lined with family photographs that chronicled happier times. Isabella paused before a formal portrait that showed Vincenzo and a stunning woman with dark eyes and gentle smile, flanked by 3 toddlers in matching outfits. Elena Romano had possessed the kind of effortless elegance that suggested she'd been raised with wealth but hadn't let it distance her from genuine warmth. "She would have liked you," said a voice behind her, and Isabella turned to find Francesca Romano studying the same photograph with the complicated expression of someone who'd lost a beloved sister-in-law and gained the responsibility for her orphaned children. Francesca was younger than Vincenzo, perhaps 35, with the same dark eyes but softer features that suggested she'd been protected from the harder realities of family business. "I'm Isabella Martinez," Isabella said, extending her hand. "You must be Francesca. Mr. Romano mentioned you've been caring for the children." "Trying to." Francesca's smile was rueful, acknowledging 18 months of loving effort that had produced little measurable progress. "I have a master's degree in early childhood education, but nothing I learned in graduate school prepared me for this. They're not defiant or difficult. They're just absent, like they're waiting for permission to come back to life." The 3 women continued down the hallway toward voices that grew more distinct as they approached the children's common area. Isabella could hear Vincenzo speaking in the gentle tone she'd never heard him use at the restaurant, patient and encouraging in a way that revealed how completely his dangerous persona dissolved around his children. The playroom was a child's paradise, designed by someone who understood both luxury and practicality. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with classics and contemporary children's literature in both English and Italian. A reading corner featured overstuffed chairs, sized for small bodies, positioned near windows that offered views of the garden where someone had installed playground equipment that looked both expensive and unused. Art supplies were organised with museum-quality care in glass-fronted cabinets, paintbrushes and coloured pencils arranged by colour gradation like a rainbow made tangible. but the room's centerpiece was a dedicated art studio that took Isabella's breath away. Professional easels sized for children, a pottery wheel with accompanying tools, watercolor stations with paper that looked thick enough for serious artistic work, storage systems that could accommodate any creative project a child might imagine. It was the kind of therapeutic space that Isabella had dreamed of having access to during her volunteer work, now made available for 3 specific children who needed exactly this kind of intervention. Vincenzo stood near the window with Marco, Sophia and Lucia, all 4 of them studying what appeared to be architectural blueprints spread across a child-sized table. The children were dressed in clothes that managed to look both expensive and practical. Soft cotton pants and shirts in muted colours that wouldn't show paint stains, sturdy shoes designed for active play, sweaters that suggested someone had been paying attention to the morning's autumn chill. "Isabella's here," Vincenzo announced, and all 3 children looked up with the immediate recognition that surprised her. They remembered, not just her face, but the feeling of being understood, of being seen as complete people rather than problems to be solved. "Good morning, Marco. Good morning, Sophia. Good morning, Lucia." Isabella knelt to their eye level, establishing the respectful communication pattern that had worked so effectively at the restaurant. "Thank you for letting me visit your home. This art studio is absolutely beautiful." Marco approached first, carrying a blue crayon like a diplomatic offering. He held it out to Isabella with the careful formality of someone presenting state secrets, then pointed to a blank sheet of paper positioned on one of the easels. His message was clear. "Please draw something. Show us your language too." Isabella accepted the crayon with appropriate ceremony and moved to the easel, considering what image might serve as her introduction to their private world. She drew a simple house with 4 windows and a door, then added 3 small figures standing in front of it. But instead of leaving the drawing static, she added motion lines around the figures and a sun in the corner with rays that extended toward the house like protective arms. Sophia studied the drawing with the focused attention of a music critic analysing a symphony, then retrieved a red crayon and added her own contribution. Musical notes floating above the house like visible sound, connected by flowing lines that suggested melody made tangible. Lucia followed with the yellow crayon, adding flowers around the house's foundation and a path leading to the front door, creating an invitation for visitors to approach. Within 10 minutes, the 3 children and Isabella had created a collaborative artwork that communicated more about their potential relationship than any verbal contract could have established. They were willing to trust her creative presence in their space. They wanted to build something beautiful together. They understood that art could be a conversation between people who spoke the same visual language. "Remarkable," said a voice from behind them, and Isabella turned to find Dr. James Mitchell, the family physician, observing their interaction with the clinical fascination of someone witnessing an unprecedented therapeutic breakthrough. He was a distinguished man in his 70s, carrying himself with the authority that came from decades of treating both bullet wounds and childhood fevers with equal competence. "Dr. Mitchell has been working with us since the accident," Vincenzo explained. "He's also the one who'll be overseeing your integration into the household routine." Isabella stood and shook the doctor's hand, noting the way he studied her with the careful assessment of someone who understood that his patient's recovery might depend on her competence. "I'm looking forward to working with you, Dr. Mitchell. Having medical oversight will be invaluable as we develop treatment protocols." "The children have shown more engagement in the past 10 minutes than I've observed in the previous 6 months, Dr. Mitchell said. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Behind them, the children had moved to the pottery wheel, where someone had left clay ready for moulding. Without instruction or supervision, they began working together on what appeared to be a collaborative sculpture. Marco shaping the base with geometric precision, Sophia adding rhythmic ridges around the circumference, Lucia creating small figures that would eventually be positioned around the clay structure like citizens in a miniature city. "They're building together," Francesca whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I haven't seen them collaborate on anything since the accident. The words hung in the air unspoken, but understood by everyone present. For 18 months these children had existed in parallel silence, present in the same space, but isolated in their individual trauma responses. Now they were creating something together, communicating through clay, and shared purpose in ways that suggested their emotional connection to each other might be healing alongside their connection to the external world. Angelo Torino chose that moment to enter the playroom, his expensive suit and cologne creating an immediate contrast to the children's creative atmosphere. His eyes moved quickly between Isabella and the children's artwork, his expression revealing nothing about his assessment of the situation. But Isabella noticed that the children's collaborative energy shifted subtly when he appeared, becoming more cautious, less spontaneous. "Miss Martinez," Angelo said, his voice carrying the courteous authority of someone who understood his position in the household hierarchy. "Welcome to Romano Estate. I'm Angelo Torino, Mr. Romano's lieutenant and head of family security. I'll be coordinating your background clearances and safety protocols." Isabella shook his hand while noting the way the children seemed to retreat slightly into their individual creative projects, their collaborative sculpture temporarily abandoned. Angelo's presence changed the room's energy in ways that suggested his relationship with the children was correct, but not comfortable, protective, but not nurturing. "I appreciate your attention to security, Mr. Torino," Isabella said. "The children's safety is obviously the primary concern in any therapeutic work." "Indeed, which is why we'll need to establish clear boundaries about your access to family information, your communication with outside parties, and your understanding of the discretion required in this position." Angelo's smile was professional but cold, the expression of someone who viewed Isabella as a potential security risk rather than a therapeutic asset. Vincenzo's voice cut through the tension with quiet authority. "Angelo, Miss Martinez and I have already discussed confidentiality requirements. She understands the sensitivity of her position." The brief exchange revealed household dynamics that Isabella filed away for future reference. Angelo's protective instincts were admirable, but possibly excessive. Vincenzo's patience with his lieutenant's concerns suggested long-standing loyalty, but also growing frustration with overprotectiveness. The children's response to Angelo indicated respect without warmth, suggesting their relationship was built on duty rather than affection. As the morning progressed, Isabella was introduced to the rest of the household staff. Housekeepers who maintained the children's spaces with obsessive care, tutors who provided private education when the children felt ready for academic work, and security personnel who moved through the house like protective shadows. Everyone treated the children with genuine warmth, but Isabella noticed that none of them had developed the kind of communication breakthrough that had occurred naturally through artistic collaboration. By lunchtime, Marco, Sophia and Lucia had completed their clay sculpture, a house surrounded by musical notes and tiny figures, with geometric patterns forming the foundation and flowing designs creating the roof. It was their collective statement about what home could look like when all their individual languages were spoken and understood. Isabella stood in the art studio doorway, watching the children clean their hands with the careful attention to detail that suggested this routine was important to them. In 6 hours, she would drive back to Astoria and her old life. But in 2 weeks, this would be her new reality. Children who were learning to trust her creative presence. A family that had invested everything in her potential to help them heal, and resources that could transform her amateur therapeutic techniques into professional interventions. The responsibility was terrifying, the opportunity was unprecedented, and the children were waiting for her to prove that Tuesday's breakthrough hadn't been a coincidence, but the beginning of their journey back to voices they'd temporarily misplaced. Outside the studio windows, autumn sunlight turned the estate's gardens into a mosaic of gold and crimson, and Isabella allowed herself to believe that some transformations were worth risking everything to achieve. 3 weeks into Isabella's new life at Romano Estate, The impossible had become routine. Every morning at 8 a.m. she would find Marco arranging his breakfast fruit into perfect geometric patterns, while Sophia tapped rhythmic sequences against her juice glass, and Lucia drew tiny family portraits in the condensation on the window. They hadn't spoken yet, but their silence had transformed from empty absence into purposeful communication that Isabella could read like sheet music written in colours and shapes. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning that felt like every other Tuesday morning until it wasn't. Isabella had developed a daily routine that honoured each child's individual communication style while encouraging gradual expansion of their comfort zones. Marco worked with architectural models, building structures that became more complex each day as his confidence grew. Sophia explored musical painting, creating visual representations of melodies that existed only in her mind. Lucia crafted miniature worlds populated with clay figures that told stories about connection, loss, and the slow process of healing. This particular Tuesday, Isabella had introduced a new activity: collaborative storytelling through sequential art. She'd prepared 3 large sheets of paper, each divided into comic strip panels that the children could fill with drawings that would eventually combine into a single narrative. The goal was to help them practice communication that required cooperation, timing, and trust in each other's creative contributions. Marco chose the first panel and began drawing what appeared to be a house. But as Isabella watched, she realised he was creating an architectural cross-section, showing the interior rooms with the precision of a professional blueprint. Kitchen, living room, bedrooms, all connected by hallways that suggested movement and family life. Sophia took the second panel and added her musical interpretation. Visual sound waves flowing through Marco's house, connecting the rooms with rhythmic patterns that suggested voices, laughter, music filling the spaces between the walls. Her additions transformed her brother's technical drawing into something alive and dynamic. Lucia studied their combined work for several minutes before approaching the third panel. With careful deliberation, she began drawing people. Not the stick figures that had characterized her early artwork, but detailed human forms with distinct faces, clothing, and expressions. A tall man in a suit, a woman with long dark hair, 3 children holding hands, additional figures that appeared to be household staff, friends, extended family. Isabella watched the collaborative story emerge with the fascination of someone witnessing art therapy. Theory transformed into practical breakthrough. The children were creating a visual narrative about home, family, connection, and the sounds that filled spaces when people felt safe enough to make noise. Then Marco did something unprecedented. He pointed to his architectural drawing, looked directly at Isabella, and opened his mouth. No sound emerged, but his lips formed a clear, deliberate shape. He was trying to say, house. Isabella's heart stopped, then started again with such force that she worried the children might hear it hammering against her ribs. 18 months of silence, and Marco was attempting to speak. Not successfully, not audibly, but intentionally. He was ready to try voice again. House, Isabella whispered, modelling the word for him while pointing to his drawing. You drew a beautiful house, Marco. Marco tried again, his small mouth working around the word like a key, trying to find the right lock. This time a sound emerged. Not quite house, more like HSS, but unmistakably intentional vocalization after 18 months of silence. Sophia had been watching her brother's efforts with the concentrated attention of someone witnessing a miracle. When Marco produced his whispered "Orchis," she clapped her hands together in 4 precise beats, then pointed to her musical patterns and attempted her own word, music. It came out as miss, barely audible, but definitely present. Sophia Romano had just attempted to speak for the first time since her mother's death. Lucia, not to be outdone by her siblings' courage, pointed to her family figures and whispered something that might have been people, but sounded more like people. 3 attempts, 3 partial successes, 3 children who were ready to start reclaiming their voices. Isabella contained her excitement with the professional control that trauma therapy had taught her, understanding that overwhelming reactions could frighten children back into silence. Instead, she responded to their efforts with the calm appreciation she might show for any successful artistic collaboration. Marco drew our house, Sophia added music, Lucia filled it with people. You've created a story about what makes a house become a home. She paused, letting them process the validation before adding, Would you like to show Papa your story? All three children nodded simultaneously, their first unified response to any suggestion since Isabella had started working with them. They wanted to share their achievement. They were proud of their collaborative effort. They were ready to communicate with their father through the visual language they'd been developing. 20 minutes later, Vincenzo Romano stood in the art studio doorway, staring at his children's sequential artwork while processing what Isabella had just told him about their vocal attempts. For a man who controlled international shipping routes and negotiated million-dollar agreements through careful emotional manipulation, he seemed remarkably undone by 3 whispered words from his children. They tried to speak, he said, his voice carrying the wonder of someone witnessing resurrection. They're ready to speak, Isabella corrected gently. Their brains have been preparing for this moment for months. The art therapy has been rebuilding their communication pathways gradually, safely, at their own pace. Today was just the day their voices felt ready to join the conversation their hands have been having all along. Vincenzo approached the children with the careful reverence of someone entering sacred space. He knelt beside their artwork, studying the details of Marco's architectural precision, Sophia's musical translations, and Lucia's family portraits. Tell me about your story, he said softly. Marco pointed to his house drawing and whispered "Hasses" again, the sound slightly stronger than his first attempt. Sophia tapped her musical patterns while whispering "Miss." Lucia pointed to the family figures and managed something closer to people on her second try. Vincenzo's composure cracked completely. 18 months of desperate hope, expensive failures and accumulating grief dissolved into tears that he didn't try to hide from his children. He wasn't crying from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing his children's voices begin to return to the world. It's beautiful, he whispered, the most beautiful story I've ever heard. The children responded to their father's emotional reaction with increased confidence. They began pointing to different elements of their artwork, attempting words that came out as approximations but carried clear, intentional meaning. Window, door, family, happy. Each word was a small victory, each attempt evidence that their voices had been hibernating rather than lost. Maria Santos appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound of unusual activity in the art studio. When she saw the children pointing and whispering while Vincenzo knelt beside their collaborative artwork, her own composure evaporated into grateful tears. "Dios mio," she whispered, "they're talking." "They're trying," Isabella said, maintaining her role as therapeutic interpreter, even as she battled her own emotional response to the breakthrough. "This is just the beginning. We'll need to be patient, consistent, and careful not to overwhelm them with expectations." But the children seemed energized rather than overwhelmed by their success. They spent the rest of the morning creating additional artwork while practicing their tentative vocalizations, each attempted word building their confidence for the next effort. By lunchtime, they were managing 2-syllable approximations and pointing to objects around the room while trying to name them. Dr. Mitchell arrived for his weekly check-in to find the children engaged in the most active communication he'd witnessed since the accident. His medical assessment confirmed what Isabella already knew. Their vocal cords were physically healthy, their hearing was intact, and their cognitive development was progressing normally. The silence had been psychological protection, not physiological damage. "This is unprecedented recovery," Dr. Mitchell told Vincenzo privately while the children continued their art therapy session. "In my experience with selective mutism cases, Gradual vocalization like this suggests they're likely to achieve full speech recovery within 6 to 12 months. 6 to 12 months. After 18 months of silence, the possibility of hearing his children's full voices again felt like a promise too dangerous to believe. But watching them whisper and point and collaborate on increasingly complex artistic projects, Vincenzo allowed himself to hope that Isabella Martinez had given his family something more valuable than security or wealth, the return of sound to rooms that had been quiet for too long. That evening, as Isabella prepared to return to her Astoria apartment for the final time before her permanent move to the estate, she found Vincenzo waiting for her in the main foyer. His expression showed none of the controlled authority that characterized his public persona. Instead, he looked like a father who'd just been given the greatest gift imaginable. "I don't know how to thank you," he said simply. "Help them practice," Isabella replied. "Be patient with their progress, celebrate every small victory without pressuring them for larger ones, and remember that their voices came back because they felt safe enough to risk being heard." Vincenzo nodded, understanding that Isabella's instructions were both therapeutic protocol and personal wisdom earned through her own journey back from silence. As Isabella walked toward the estate's front gates where her taxi waited, she could hear sounds drifting from the children's wing that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago. Whispered words, attempted songs, and the soft murmur of voices learning to trust themselves again. It wasn't conversation yet, but it was the beginning of conversation, which felt like enough of a miracle for one Tuesday afternoon. Behind her in the art studio, 3 children sat with their father, practicing words that would eventually become sentences, sentences that would eventually become stories, and stories that would eventually fill their home with the kind of sound that transforms houses into families. 2 months after Isabella's permanent move to Romano Estate, the guest house had transformed into something that felt dangerously close to home. Her morning routine now began at 6:30 a.m. in a kitchen that overlooked gardens she was learning to love, preparing coffee in a machine that cost more than her previous monthly rent, while Carmen Martinez sat at the breakfast table working through physical therapy exercises designed to slow her dementia's progression. The integration had been seamless in ways that surprised everyone, including Isabella herself. Carmen had adapted to luxury with the practical grace of someone who'd spent 70 years making the best of whatever circumstances life provided. The estate's medical staff monitored her condition with the kind of attention that money could buy, but genuine care made meaningful. Dr. Mitchell visited twice weekly, not just for the children, but to ensure Carmen's treatments were adjusted as her needs changed. "Mija, you look happy," Carmen observed as Isabella prepared breakfast, her voice carrying the clarity that came and went like morning fog. "Different happy than before, like you found something you didn't know you were looking for." Isabella paused in her coffee preparation, considering her foster mother's words. Carmen's dementia had stolen many things, but her ability to read emotional truth with surgical precision remained intact. Isabella did feel different. Not just financially secure or professionally fulfilled, but genuinely content in ways she'd never experienced. The children had progressed beyond anyone's most optimistic projections. Marco was constructing complete sentences, his vocabulary expanding daily as he discovered the joy of explaining his geometric theories to anyone willing to listen. Sophia had begun humming melodies that she then translated into paintings, creating a synesthetic bridge between her musical and visual languages. Lucia asked questions constantly, her curiosity about the world accelerating as her confidence in being heard grew stronger. But the most significant change was their family dynamic. Isabella had moved from the guest house into the main residence 3 weeks ago, officially to provide overnight support if the children experienced nightmares or regression episodes. Unofficially, because Vincenzo had requested her presence during family dinners, bedtime routines, and weekend activities with the quiet intensity of a man who discovered something essential was missing from his life. "Good morning, Isabella." Vincenzo's voice carried the warmth that had replaced his initial formality over the past month. He appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing casual clothes that somehow made him more attractive than his expensive suits, dark hair still damp from his morning shower, carrying the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested he was completely comfortable with Isabella's presence in his private spaces. "Good morning," she replied, handing him coffee prepared exactly the way he preferred it after 6 weeks of careful observation. "The children are already in the art studio. Marco wants to show you his latest architectural project, and Sophia has been working on a painting that she says represents Tuesday." "Tuesday has a visual representation?" According to Sophia, Tuesday is golden yellow with blue edges and sounds like piano music played underwater. Isabella smiled, remembering Sophia's earnest explanation of temporal synesthesia that had left Dr. Mitchell scrambling to research childhood sensory processing development. "She's created an entire emotional calendar. Wednesday is purple with sharp corners." Vincenzo's laugh was genuine, unguarded in the way it only became around Isabella and his children. "My daughter is either an artistic genius or delightfully insane." "Both, definitely both." The easy intimacy of their morning conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's voices calling from the main house, no longer the whispered attempts of 2 months ago, but clear, confident communication that filled spaces previously dominated by silence. Isabella and Vincenzo exchanged the look of shared accomplishment that had become their secret language over the weeks of working together. Family breakfast had evolved into Isabella's favourite part of each day. The children gathered around a table that had been silent for 18 months, now filled with chatter about art projects, questions about the world beyond the estate, and the kind of sibling banter that suggested their emotional connections to each other were healing alongside their individual voices. "Papa, Isabella said we could plant vegetables in the garden," Lucia announced, her voice clear and confident as she outlined plans that involved considerable dirt and probable chaos. "Tomatoes and basil and peppers like Nonna Rosa uses in her sauce." "Isabella said this, did she?" Vincenzo looked at Isabella with amusement that concealed deeper appreciation for the way she'd integrated practical learning opportunities into their therapeutic routine. "And what else has Isabella suggested?" "Cooking lessons," Marco added, his systematic mind already organising the project into logical components. "Isabella knows how to make pasta from scratch. She learned from her foster mother, who learned from her grandmother in Puerto Rico." "We could have a family cooking day," Sophia suggested, her musician's sense of rhythm extending into meal planning. "Everyone makes one part of the dinner and then we eat it together like a real family." Like a real family. The words hung in the air with weight that none of the adults had anticipated. For the children, this was simply their current reality. A house filled with voices, shared meals, collaborative projects, and the kind of security that came from being surrounded by people who genuinely enjoyed their company. But for Vincenzo and Isabella, Sophia's casual reference to real family represented something more complicated. Isabella had become integral to their daily life in ways that extended far beyond her professional responsibilities. She joined them for meals, not because it was required, but because the children requested her presence, and Vincenzo had stopped pretending he didn't enjoy her company. She participated in bedtime routines because the children felt safer with her nearby, and Vincenzo appreciated having someone who understood their individual needs. She spent evenings in the family room reading or working on her own projects while the children played, creating the kind of domestic tranquility that Vincenzo hadn't experienced since Elena's death. Angelo Torino chose that moment to appear in the breakfast room doorway, his expression carrying the carefully controlled tension that had characterized his interactions with Isabella since her arrival. He was dressed in his usual expensive suit, projected his usual air of authority, but something in his posture suggested barely contained frustration. "Boss, we need to discuss the Brooklyn situation," Angelo said, his voice carrying urgency that didn't quite mask his disapproval of conducting business discussions in front of the children and Isabella. The children's chatter quieted immediately, their newly confident voices subdued by Angelo's presence. Isabella had noticed this pattern over the past month. Angelo's appearances consistently changed the family's energy from relaxed intimacy to cautious formality. "After breakfast," Vincenzo replied, without looking away from his children. "Family time is protected time, Angelo. You know this." "Of course. My apologies." Angelo's smile was professionally correct, but failed to reach his eyes. "Good morning, children. Isabella." His use of her first name carried a slight emphasis that suggested familiarity he hadn't earned, a presumption that made Isabella uncomfortable for reasons she couldn't articulate. Angelo had been unfailingly polite during her time at the estate, but his courtesy felt like performance rather than genuine respect. After Angelo's departure, the breakfast conversation resumed its natural flow, but Isabella noticed that the children remained slightly subdued, their spontaneous chatter replaced by more careful communication. Whatever Angelo's relationship to the family, his presence reminded everyone that their domestic tranquility existed within a larger context of danger and business obligations. Later that morning, as Isabella worked with the children on their latest collaborative project, a three-dimensional map of their emotional territories constructed from clay, paint and found objects, she found herself thinking about family dynamics that went beyond therapeutic protocols. The children had started referring to her presence as permanent rather than temporary. Vincenzo included her in planning conversations about their education, their future, their long-term development. Even the household staff had begun treating her as a family member rather than an employee. But Isabella's role remained officially undefined, existing in the ambiguous space between professional caregiver and something more personal. She lived in the family home, participated in family activities, and had become integral to the children's daily emotional security. Yet she had no legal standing, no official status, no protection if circumstances changed. "Isabella, look what I made," Marco said, interrupting her philosophical concerns with the immediate reality of a 6-year-old who discovered he could sculpt emotions into physical form. His contribution to their collaborative map was a clay structure that resembled a fortress, but with windows that let light pass through and doors that opened to welcome visitors. "It's beautiful, Marco. Tell me about it." "It's how I feel now," Marco explained with the matter-of-fact clarity that characterized his communication since recovering his voice. "Safe on the inside, but not closed off from the outside, like home, but better than before." Better than before. Isabella understood that Marco was comparing his current emotional state to the period before his mother's death, when security had felt absolute and loss seemed impossible. His clay fortress suggested that he'd found a new kind of safety, one that acknowledged vulnerability while maintaining openness to love and connection. Sophia and Lucia had created their own emotional territories. Sophia's was a musical landscape, with hills that sang when touched, and Lucia's was a village populated with tiny figures that represented everyone she loved, positioned close enough for conversation, but with space for individual growth. Together, their collaborative map told the story of 3 children who journeyed through silence and emerged with voices strong enough to describe complex internal worlds. They'd moved from survival to thriving, from isolation to connection, from fear to confidence in their ability to communicate their needs and feelings. As Isabella helped them add finishing touches to their emotional map, she realized that her own territory had transformed just as dramatically. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly seen, genuinely valued, and permanently wanted. The children needed her expertise, but Vincenzo seemed to need her presence in ways that extended far beyond professional services. That evening, after the children had been tucked into beds in rooms that now echoed with their whispered conversations with each other, Isabella found Vincenzo in his study, reviewing business documents that probably involved activities she preferred not to understand. But when she appeared in the doorway, he immediately set aside his work with the automatic priority adjustment that had become natural over the past month. "How are they?" he asked, though he'd already checked on each child personally during their bedtime routine. Happy, confident, excited about tomorrow's cooking project. Isabella settled into the chair across from his desk, a position that had evolved from formal business meetings to comfortable evening conversations. "Vincenzo, I wanted to talk to you about something." The use of his first name, which had replaced Mr. Romano gradually over the past weeks, drew his complete attention. Isabella had been careful not to presume familiarity beyond what their working relationship required, but the boundaries between professional and personal had been blurring in ways that felt natural rather than inappropriate. "Of course, what's on your mind?" "The children are asking questions about permanence, about whether I'll still be here for Christmas, for their next birthday, for important moments in their future. And I realise I don't know how to answer them because we've never discussed the long-term parameters of this arrangement." Vincenzo was quiet for a moment, studying her face with the careful attention he typically reserved for crucial business negotiations. "What would you like those parameters to be?" The question carried weight that extended far beyond employment contracts. Isabella recognised that Vincenzo was asking about her intentions, her commitment, her willingness to become permanently woven into the fabric of his family's life. "I want to be here," she said simply, "not just professionally, but personally. These children have become essential to me, and this family has become home in ways I never thought possible. But I need to know that this feeling is mutual, that I'm not projecting stability onto a situation that's actually temporary." Vincenzo stood and moved around the desk, settling into the chair beside hers rather than maintaining the formal distance of employer and employee. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet intensity that she'd learned to associate with his most honest moments. "Isabella, you've given us back our voices. All of us, not just the children. This house was a mausoleum before you arrived. Now it's alive with sound, with laughter, with the kind of hope I thought I'd lost forever." He paused, reaching for words that could convey feelings he hadn't expected to experience again. "You're not temporary, you're family, and if you're willing, I'd like to make that official in every way possible." The air between them crackled with possibility, with the recognition that their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper, more personal, more permanent than either had anticipated. Isabella felt her heart racing as she processed the implications of Vincenzo's words, the promise of belonging that she'd been afraid to hope for. Outside the study windows, autumn rain began falling on the estate's gardens, but inside, two people who'd found unexpected love in the midst of healing began planning a future that looked nothing like either had imagined 6 months ago. Sunday family dinner had become a sacred ritual at Romano Estate, the one evening each week when business calls were forbidden, security briefings were postponed, and the dining room transformed into something that felt more like a Norman Rockwell painting than the headquarters of a criminal empire. Isabella had suggested the tradition 6 weeks ago, understanding that regular family meals could reinforce the children's sense of stability while creating opportunities for communication that felt natural rather than therapeutic. Tonight's dinner carried special significance because Isabella had introduced her latest innovation, personalised dinner plates that allowed each family member to express their thoughts, feelings or desires through drawings before the meal began. She discovered the technique during her volunteer work at the Crisis Centre, where non-verbal children had used art supplies to communicate needs they couldn't yet speak aloud. For the Romano children, who were rapidly developing their verbal skills but still relied heavily on visual communication, the dinner plates offered a bridge between their old language and their new voices. The dining room glowed with candlelight that cast warm shadows across walls lined with family photographs spanning 3 generations. Elena's portrait held the place of honour above the fireplace, her gentle smile watching over family dinners that had resumed their joy after 2 years of silence. The table itself was set with Isabella's latest therapeutic tool, pristine white ceramic plates surrounded by food-safe markers in every colour imaginable. "The rules are simple. Isabella explained as Vincenzo, Francesca, Maria, and the children gathered around the table. Before we eat, everyone draws something on their plate that represents how they're feeling, what they're hoping for, or what they want to share with the family. Then we'll go around the table and let each person explain their drawing. Marco approached the task with his characteristic systematic precision, selecting a blue marker and creating geometric patterns that had evolved far beyond his early angular designs. But tonight, his patterns included curves, flowing lines that suggested movement and growth rather than rigid structure. At the centre of his design, he drew a house with multiple rooms, each room containing stick figures engaged in different activities: cooking, reading, playing, creating art. "This is our family house," Marco explained, his 6-year-old voice clear and confident as he pointed to different rooms in his drawing. "This room is where Isabella teaches us art. This room is where Papa reads us stories. This room is where Maria makes the best food in the world. And this room—" He pointed to a central space where all the stick figures seemed to be gathering. "This is where we're all together and everyone is happy." Sophia had chosen red and yellow markers, creating flowing musical patterns that danced across her plate's surface like visible melodies. But woven throughout her musical designs were small hearts, flowers, and what appeared to be tiny wedding rings connected by golden threads. "Mine is a song about families who choose each other," Sophia announced, her artistic sensibilities expressing concepts that surprised everyone with their emotional sophistication. "Sometimes people aren't born into families, but they find each other and decide to be a family anyway. The music is happy because choosing love is always a celebration." Lucia, the youngest and often the most perceptive, had created the most complex drawing of the three. Her plate showed a large circle filled with small figures holding hands, but at the edge of the circle was a single figure that appeared to be stepping forward, moving from outside the family group into the centre, where a taller figure with long dark hair was waiting with open arms. "This is Isabella joining our real family," Lucia said, with the matter-of-fact clarity that characterised her observations. "She was outside before, helping us but not really belonging. But now she's moving inside the circle where she's supposed to be, and Papa is waiting for her because he loves her too." The silence that followed Lucia's explanation was heavy with recognition, acknowledgement, and the kind of truth that children could speak without understanding its full implications. Isabella felt her cheeks burning as she processed what the 6-year-old had observed and chosen to illustrate for public consumption. Vincenzo's expression revealed nothing, but his stillness suggested careful consideration of his daughter's artistic revelation. Francesca had drawn a simple but powerful image: 2 overlapping hearts with the words "Familia per sempre" written in careful script around the border. Family forever. Her contribution was both blessing and recognition that something fundamental had shifted in their household dynamics. Maria's plate showed a kitchen filled with people cooking together, her drawing style reminiscent of the folk art that decorated her Puerto Rican grandmother's home. But at the centre of her kitchen scene, she'd drawn a woman teaching 3 children to knead bread, while a man watched from the doorway with obvious love and contentment. "This is my dream," Maria said, her accented English thick with emotion. "A kitchen full of voices, children who laugh while they learn, and love that makes even work feel like celebration. Isabella brought this dream to life." Isabella stared at her blank plate, overwhelmed by the family's artistic declarations of love, acceptance, and permanence. She'd introduced this exercise to help the children express their feelings, never anticipating that it would become a referendum on her place in their lives. But as she picked up a green marker, her hand moved with the certainty of someone who finally understood her own heart. She drew a tree with deep roots and strong branches, but instead of leaves, each branch ended in a small figure, representing a member of their extended family. The roots were labelled with words like healing, trust, growth, and love. At the base of the tree, she drew 2 figures planting new seedlings that would eventually grow into their own strong trees. "This is what you've all given me," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her professional composure. "Roots, a place to grow, a family that chose me when I thought belonging was impossible, and the hope that we can plant seeds for the future that will grow into something beautiful and permanent." Vincenzo had been watching the entire exchange with the careful attention of someone processing information that could change everything. His plate remained blank, his markers untouched, but his eyes never left Isabella's face as she spoke about roots and belonging and permanent love. Then he picked up a black marker and drew something that made everyone at the table hold their breath. A simple diamond ring, rendered with the precision of someone who'd been thinking about this image for weeks. Around the ring he wrote a single question. "Isabella Carmen Martinez, will you marry me?" The proposal was so unexpected, so perfectly timed with the children's artistic declarations of acceptance, that Isabella felt the world shift on its axis. 6 months ago, she'd been a waitress struggling to pay her foster mother's medical bills. Tonight, she was being asked to become the legal and permanent mother to 3 children she'd fallen desperately in love with, wife to a man who'd shown her what partnership could feel like when built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The children erupted in excited chatter before Isabella could respond, their voices overlapping in a symphony of approval and anticipation. Marco began explaining the legal implications of marriage with the systematic thoroughness that characterized his approach to any new concept. Sophia started humming what sounded like a wedding march, while Lucia clapped her hands and announced that she'd always wanted Isabella to be her real mama. "Yes," Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible above the children's celebration. Then, louder, with the confidence of someone stepping fully into her new life. "Yes, Vincenzo, yes to all of it, yes to marriage, yes to family, yes to forever." The kiss that followed was witnessed by 3 children who cheered as if their favourite team had scored the winning goal, by Francesca, who wept with joy for her brother's happiness, and by Maria, who immediately began planning a wedding feast that would honour both Italian and Puerto Rican traditions. But the moment was interrupted by Angelo Torino's arrival, his expensive suit and grim expression creating an immediate contrast to the family's celebration. His eyes took in the scene quickly, the art-covered plates, the obvious proposal that had just been accepted, the children's excited chatter about wedding plans and becoming a real family. "Forgive the interruption," Angelo said, his voice carrying barely controlled tension. "Boss, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. The Torino territory meeting has been moved to tonight." Vincenzo's jaw tightened with the frustration of a man whose most important personal moments were constantly interrupted by business obligations. "Angelo, this is family time. Whatever the situation is, it can wait until tomorrow." "Actually, it can't." Angelo's smile was cold, professional, and somehow threatening in ways that made the children stop celebrating and move closer to Isabella. "The meeting isn't optional, and my uncle is expecting you within the hour, family celebration or not." Isabella felt the temperature in the room drop as Angelo's words sank in. This wasn't a request or even a strong suggestion. It was a command disguised as business necessity, delivered by someone who'd clearly timed this interruption to maximum effect. The children sensed the shift in energy immediately, their celebration quieting to worried whispers as they recognized that their perfect family moment was being threatened by forces they couldn't control or understand. Isabella's protective instincts activated as she moved closer to their chairs, understanding that whatever Angelo wanted, it would disrupt the security and happiness they'd just finished celebrating. Vincenzo stood slowly, his expression transitioning from loving family man to dangerous criminal authority, with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent 15 years managing dual identities. "Angelo, we'll discuss this privately." "Of course, boss, but the car is already waiting." Angelo's eyes locked with Isabella's for a moment, his expression conveying something that felt like a warning wrapped in false courtesy. "Congratulations on your engagement, Isabella. I'm sure it will be memorable." As Angelo left the dining room, the celebration resumed, but Isabella noticed that the joy felt forced now, shadowed by the recognition that their happiness existed within a larger context of danger and obligation. The children returned to their excited wedding planning, but their voices carried a note of uncertainty that suggested they too understood that perfect moments in their world were always temporary. Later that evening, as Isabella helped the children prepare for bed while Vincenzo attended his obligatory meeting, she found herself studying their dinner plates, which Maria had carefully preserved before washing. The artistic record of their family's transformation from broken to whole, from separate to united, from hoping to belonging. But Angelo's interruption had reminded her that their new happiness would need to be defended, that some people might view her presence as a threat to existing power structures, and that the most dangerous enemies were often the ones who smiled while planning destruction. Looking at the children's drawings of family and forever, Isabella felt the first whisper of unease about challenges that lay ahead. Tonight had been perfect. Tomorrow would require vigilance.